Hello and welcome to Tea with the FT Advisor, a series of podcasts in association with the Women's Wealth Alliance focused on helping more women in the financial advisory profession. I'm Simoney Kyriakou, editor of FT Advisor.
And I'm Vanessa Barnes, chair of the Women's Wealth Alliance and founder of my own IFA firm, Hannay Wealth LLP. And today's guest is Gillian Hepburn. She's the head of Advisor Sales and Solutions at Vanguard. Welcome, Gillian. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we are talking a lot in these series about both helping women into the financial advice profession and helping women get financial advice. And we know that that's a particular passion of yours, to kind of close that wealth gap. Can you talk a little bit about the women's wealth gap and where you see this being positioned?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you start with the actual wealth gap, I always go to the Scottish Widows Survey. So I think they do a great piece of work in terms of not just the gender pension gap, but now the gender investment gap. And pardon me if I use a couple of stats, because I think it's always important to put some context around this. But unfortunately, in the last year, the gender pension gap actually widened. So we're seeing women typically retire with an average annual income of £13,000 as against 19 for men. It doesn't sound a lot, does it? But actually, when you roll that up over the many years, then it is. And we know why that happens. You know, around 50% of women actually take a career break, and that's not always about looking after their children. It can be looking after wider family as well. And I think we always need to bear that in mind in terms of context. And that also determines the average age of some of the women that take some form of a career break. So, you know, it's interesting, by age 55, 1 in 5 of us will have spent more than 5 years out of the workforce.
Right.
Yeah, so when you think about it, that's a long time with an impact. So a 5-year mid-career break could reduce retirement savings by about £70,000.
Yeah.
So it just all compounds in terms of why we have this gap. So, you know, obviously we can talk later about what we can do about that, but it's about how we support, I think, women through different types of career breaks, understanding the impact that that's actually going to have on their retirement planning. And explaining, and I always like to draw pictures, what is the impact of this in terms of their future retirement? What would that look like? Actually, importantly, what does it feel like? And I think what's interesting is, you know, we talk a lot, don't we, about risk. And I used to always say that I felt women weren't really risk averse, they were often more risk aware. And Vanessa, I'm guessing you'll maybe align with that in terms of...
Totally. Yeah. And it depends on which risk you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Because the risk of longevity is actually much more impactful on women than it is on men.
Totally.
And also it's about understanding what risk means and what the reward means. And I think that's not talked about enough.
And one of the things I always talk about, particularly with younger women who are starting to invest, it's like, depending on what you need this money for, please take as much risk as you can. And I know a great example I always think is default pension funds. You know, where do they sit in the risk spectrum? And do we do enough to encourage people who are, you know, fortunate enough to have a workplace pension? Don't just look at the default fund. There are usually other options. And I think that whole risk-reward spectrum is just so important. So we've become, I think, a more risk-averse society in many ways. I often think the COVID drives some of that. I don't know. Debate. It's an interesting one.
But also, don't you think, though, that the stats also show that once women do take the plunge of investing, they're way more resilient to volatile markets and they stay in.
And they stay. Yeah. They absolutely are more likely to stay the course. Yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of what we see. So it's how do we get them to make that first step? And one of the other areas that we've done a lot of work in is things like risk warnings. You know, I hate the word disclosure because it just sounds like I've got something that I'm not going to tell you about, which means that's bad. So we did a lot of work in terms of reframing some of the risk warnings and rewriting them. We've got a great white paper on it. And it's interesting, I thought, well, maybe the answer is you shorten it. The answer actually was you lengthen it and you change the language.
Right.
And it was really interesting in terms of the actual results on that. And that the risk warnings that we tested showed an uplift of those in those willing to invest. and particularly in female investors, it was 34% more of them were prepared to invest
Was
compared
that just
to
a removal
generic.
of the jargon though, or was that
Yeah, it was
a
just
more
reframing it in a different way.
Maybe not
Me
using volatility,
explaining-
because that's what
yeah.
I see all the time. I think, why on earth,
Why on earth
is
would
that
you use
an
that word?
explanation?
No, because it's just not a
No.
helpful word.
No.
But yeah, women in particular, I think the overall uptake was 25%, but for women it was 34%.
That's really good.
So it just shows that you can make a difference.
Language.
And language makes a massive difference.
I think the thing that infuriates me about the risk analysis that we do, and it's on us for sure, is it's homogenous. That we somehow come out with this group of 15 questions that your entire wealth is going to be judged on. And I've had this conversation with a client the other day, and I said, risk isn't about your overall attitude. Risk is, if next week my roof blows off and I found out my insurance is invalid, what do I do to solve that problem?
Yeah.
And the other here is, in 25 years' time, I want my 5-year-old to be able to get on the property market. And how you invest those two things is entirely different.
Yeah,
so you can't say, oh, you're a 3 or a 5 or whatever the middle thing is. You've actually got to, I think, apportion risk to the investment profile. And then there's a kind of tricky thing of then trying to make that work from a compliance point of view. But to be honest, if you're focused on the outcome, I think that you don't have to worry about the square peg and the round hole. I think the fact is you don't take the risk with this money at all. Yeah. And over here you take maximum risk because that's where you're going to get the growth from.
Yeah.
And
you've got processes then set up or created in such a way that it almost disincentivizes or disables most people from really getting it right.
I think advisors fall into two camps. I think they fall into the, I've got to do a risk analysis, it's a tick box exercise, blah, blah, blah. And there's other ones that will actually have a conversation about risk with their clients and make sure that it's embedded, that they understand. Because the last thing you ever want is someone saying, oh, I didn't want to take that much risk with that much money. But I think if you treat it as a tick box exercise, I think actually advisors are missing an opportunity. Because once clients are aligned with you on risk, they're not at all worried about understanding the mechanics of what goes on underneath it.
And that applies to men and women, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Equally so.
Yeah.
Absolutely equally so. But it also then helps when we do experience volatility. Then the client has a much better understanding, don't they, of, and let's face it, the last few years we've had numerous incidents of volatility, probably more than, in my many years in the industry. If you look back from COVID onwards, there's been, and it's interesting, one of our most downloaded charts is something we call the bull and bear chart that shows the drawdowns and then the recovery, and showing the overall trajectory irrespective of the drawdowns and the volatility going up the way. And it's about using tools like that to explain to clients in terms of the risk that you're going to take. You will experience some of that roller coaster potentially, but here's what happens in the longer run. So I think that's really important as well, because it's all interrelated, isn't it? The amount of risk that I'm prepared to take for the reward, but here's, you really need to understand that the journey, depending on the level of risk, could be quite different. Yeah. I often said way back in COVID when we talked a lot about volatility at that point, it's a great acid test, isn't it, of the risk questionnaire? Because the risk questionnaires are often a bit hypothetical, like how would you feel if, how did you feel when this happened? When you saw your portfolio drop by X%, how did you feel at that point? But how do you feel now? And so, if anything, I would like to say it helped the conversation, but actually I think experiencing some of that has helped clients.
But then these are wonderful conversations that you have, being able to use pictures and graphs to tell those stories and being able to have those conversations with clients. But here's the rub, these are clients and or potential clients, people who've already engaged somehow with a financial advisor. Yeah. There are, I think the FCA estimated there might be another 1 million people that could potentially be qualifying for advice and have never taken it. And then there's millions of people that have never taken financial advice, wouldn't even think or know how to do that. Yeah. So conversations like that, picture explanations like that are not being spoken about to millions, and to millions of women who could become better investors or who might need more help closing that pension gap.
Yeah, who need advice. Yeah, and I think that's why we have to look at various ways that can be delivered. We've got, for example, and okay, it's not full advice, but we have now got targeted support on the horizon. We've got simplified advice now, coming through some of the regulations, some of the proposals. And I think that's got to be good, because it's a stepping stone in many ways towards full advice when people really need it. I mean, as you know, I talk a lot about the whole situation on women becoming widows, and how, sadly, too many of them leave the advisor. You have to always hope that they go somewhere else. But at the very point where people need advice, really, don't walk away from it. But how do we get more women taking advice at the right time? Because it's almost like the early get yourselves on that investment journey as early as possible.
Yeah, I think Vanessa,
And I think that's
it was
important.
67%
Of women consider changing financial advice in the first year, and I think in America they did a 2-year study and it went as high as 80%. And that was mainly, well, not mainly, but there are anecdotal examples of why. Somebody approached me at a conference and said exactly the same thing happened with her mother's best friend. She'd been bereaved and she had no complaints about the plans that she had in the portfolio. She had no complaints about the overall returns she's experienced, and she had no complaints about the regularity of the service. But she said in all the years they've been dealing with the male financial advisor, he'd never once talked to her directly, looked her in the eyes. Again, we've had an example, you and I have been on a panel and had an example of somebody who was having a massive complaint because they had not even got the details of the wife on email, and yet they had given joint advice.
It was joint advice.
Yeah. Joint advice.
So that was always a warning.
You don't know the woman's name.
Yeah, no, it's a warning to
But her
advisors.
divorce lawyers had picked up on it, and they wanted
so-
all the copies of the
yes.
files. So,
She had written a letter to the advisor, which was clearly not written by the female, it was clearly written by a lawyer. And suddenly, under GDPR, they only had about 6 letters that she'd ever received jointly, and she had nothing else. And actually what had happened over time, in fairness or unfairness, that the advisor had engaged with the male partner for many years, probably after work or in the city. It was a London-based account. And suddenly, then suddenly, a divorce was taking place, and she had not been included in any of the correspondence. So it's quite tricky. And you hear all these other stories, like 66% of advisors say that it's difficult to engage both parties. Well, find a way. Many women are happy to meet separately and together. I just always believe there is a way.
yeah. I think one of the problems is, particularly with the gender pension gap, is that pension is such an ephemeral thing. You can't live in it, you can't drive it. It's a nebulous object, isn't it? But I think if you convert it, and that's the power of what we should be doing properly, is especially if you're using cash flow, you can convert it into how you pay your monthly bills, and it becomes a much more relevant thing.
Absolutely.
And we've talked about women who get divorces as well, and they sort of want a house because they want to protect the children, but how are you going to pay the electricity bill when you're 78? So it's likening asking those questions.
Right.
Then you'll get an answer.
Real life, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Real life. Yeah. This is what it's going to look like, and I love the stuff that is it the PSLE talk about in terms of what would you like your retirement to look like, and really bringing it to life. And I think that's so important. We have to talk and we have to tell stories about what your life could look like if you save and invest in a certain way as opposed to in a different way. I know there was a dreadful statistic that floated around at one point that 40% of women are relying on their partner for an income in retirement. I'm like, given the divorce rates, that's quite frankly nuts, and so we just need to get this on the radar, I think.
And also, we're not very good at advocating for women, I think. The example I've often used is, if a woman either goes part-time or reduces her workload in order to, maybe she's sandwiched between children at uni and her parents, or her parents-in-law becoming frail, and often thinks, well, look, I need to sort of get a balance here for a while, and maybe she's out of the workplace for 3 or 4, or not at the same, normally peak earning potential, but whatever reason, they've decided to drop back a bit. Yes. When she inherits that money, maybe from the in-laws or pension, she then cannot, under our rigid incremental arrangements, decide that she's going to take that inheritance and top back up her pension with all of it, because that's where she knows she's got the gap. And we don't allow that. But no one can give me a reason as to why we don't.
Yeah. And I think also people don't always understand that if you're taking a break, somebody else can pay your national insurance contributions towards ensuring that you will retire on full state pension. So there's some really simple things in terms of the communication that we can ensure takes place just to make that outcome for the client, that female client in particular, better.
And I wonder whether there's a bigger networking thing that we can do with more employers to say, well, look, if you've got women returning to the workplace, would you pay for even half an hour or an hour of a financial advisor to come in and speak to your return to workers? Actually being able to speak to people at these touch points in their lives would be really helpful. And then, of course, then that woman has the back of her mind, oh, this is what a financial advisor does. Yes, I might go and see them. But I don't think we have enough of that kind of real network. I don't think enough employers actually understand the value of just bringing in a financial advisor and paying for their time to speak to staff. I don't know if you get employers doing that.
No, not really. And there's so many more other stages. I mean, one of the things I've done with the talk is said to women who are going on maternity leave is to ask her employer would they carry on with pension contributions, because not all employers do. But actually, if you ask them, they've got no problem with it. They just haven't thought about it. And some of them do have a problem with it. So now you need to think about where you're going to come back to work, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think there are questions to be asked there. But I think also what we want to do is make sure that we get... this is about behaviours, I think. And I think you don't even need a full fat financial planner. I think if you get a really good financial coach in that talks about behaviours and risk and attitude and why you must think now about what might happen in 30 years' time, I think there's a lot as a sector that we can do to help improve that. So I think there's definitely work to be done.
Are you seeing more women come in now worried about the changes to IHT?
I don't think the impact has actually been realised at all. And I think, unfortunately, there's no appetite in government to do anything about advertising what it's actually going to mean. And the biggest worry for me isn't just that there's two issues that circulate around this. One is that people don't realise the timeline. And the fact that the bill has to put, first and foremost, that the nil rate ban is going to be apportioned between pension and non-pension assets. Who's going to work that one out? Yeah. You've got to get all the information. And we all know how messy people's financial lives. Yeah, exactly. You've got to do all of that. You've got to collect it. Legal responsibility is on the representatives. Yeah. And then when they've got those figures and they work them out, then they've got to only pay the pensions IHT from the pensions pot, and the rest of it has to be paid. So we've also had a big swap around on the institutions that can fund the IHT for you, and the lack of understanding is bad amongst planners, let alone members of the public. So there's a whole massive piece there that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, because I think it's 6 months, isn't it, to pay?
6 months, and then it's 8.75% interest.
Yikes.
And it's in the gift of HMRC as to whether or not they let you make an arrangement. So there's that issue as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the key points as well, because this will predominantly be, well, in that baby boomer generation that I talk about a lot, it will predominantly be women, won't it?
Yeah, coping with it.
Yeah. Coping with it, widows. So, the average age of the widow in the UK, I think, is 73. So suddenly at their point of most vulnerability...
the spousal exemption. So they've got the situation where on the first day, but
on the next.
So that they start worrying. Well, what will happen when I die? And then of course panic sets in, and people start giving away their assets because they think, well, I better give them away. And you actually may not even be reducing the risk.
Absolutely.
But they may be increasing their risk of not being able to pay for care should they outlive their assets. Yes.
And also there's another issue there with the Office of the Public Guardian now estimates 15 to 20% of LPAs are abused by other members of the family. Yeah. And that worries me.
That is a scary statistic, isn't it?
Yeah. And then you go into the question of capacity and how that's going to work, and all of that.
And there is lots of myths around it as well. I mean, obviously my mother sadly became widowed a few years ago, and what you see is lots of well-intentioned friends giving information and advice, and you're kind of thinking, stop, and it is a vulnerable time for people. I think the IHT thing is very interesting. I've talked a lot about wealth transfer over the years, and it's like kind of completely turbocharged the whole situation. How do we move money out? Now, at the end of the day, a pension is for pension first and foremost, but we all know that there are clients who are high net worth who had hoped that would become an inheritance. So I think there's some really interesting times ahead with all of this. Yeah.
I was just wondering if women were going to be a bit more concerned about that, because, judging from the conversation we had earlier, it's women that often think about wanting to give money to their children or pay off their student debt or help little Johnny onto the housing ladder.
Absolutely. And interesting, back to your point, where the no rate band passes, it's actually the next generation that will be dealing with this. We had some interesting research that came over from Australia, the benefit of working for a global organisation, I can pull stuff from all over the place, that said, in terms of managing the estate, it's usually the oldest daughter that it lands on, right? So how interesting. So there is an interesting female angle there. Now, if anybody's part of a family where there has been situations, I'm sure the oldest daughters are all going, yeah, do you know what, that was me. I ended up doing it.
And it impinges on all sorts of other things. This whole thing about the pension, because then you start talking about liquidity as well, and how that's going to be affected. So you can't really give money away, to your point about them wanting to, until they've worked out what liquidity needs they have over that period of time, and how that might change over that period of time. And the conversations are all going to have to change. And looking at, and I know people then start saying things to me like, well, I hear there are other kinds of plans we can make. I said, there are, but that may actually balance one of the other things. So you need to make sure that all the moving parts are in sync, otherwise you risk doing harm.
Absolutely. And that's where the well-intentioned friends are not always right. And that's where, going back to the point where we talked about when do people need advice, it's absolutely at times like these that advice is so important. We've got some new research that's coming out of the US in the next few weeks, and it does look at areas like that, the increased confidence that is given when, particularly for women, when they're using an advisor. Quite stark. Now, you could probably all guess that that'd be the case, but sometimes putting a number around it really makes a difference in terms of understanding the massive benefit that advice gives in terms of that whole reassurance and trust and peace of mind piece. It's so important.
And there's so much money is going to move. I mean, people talk about the generational wealth gap, but just between men and women, over the next 20 years, I mean, some estimates are between 5 and 7 trillion, and that's 5 times what we have under total assets under advice at the moment.
Absolutely. And then if this wealth is going to be in the hands of women, then how do we help them with that?
That's a really interesting point that you've been saying about making sure that women are involved in the conversations, and the fact that all this wealth is going to be passing to women, because we've got some new rules coming through on cohabitation, and I know that there's also lots of conversations at policy level on coercion and ways to spot coercion. If we can get those two things tightened up and make things fairer, how do you think those conversations with women are going to go?
Well, everything that's positive can only help, and it does work the other way as well. There are examples of men being subject to all sorts of other kind of abuse as well. So I think breaking down the taboos generally, but just getting people more comfortable talking about money. What do you want to happen? Having people having intergenerational discussions. I think financial planners can facilitate that, and it's good for them and their businesses. Because if you're talking to what's going to happen after and what's going to happen before and that kind of thing, then actually you're embedding yourself, in that family. They understand what you're doing and they understand how you can help them, and that benefits your business resilience down the line as well as doing the right thing by the client and making sure those outcomes are the right ones.
Absolutely. You call it the great wealth retention, don't you?
Absolutely. But it's such that piece about the wider family is such an important point, because I've always said that although I started to focus a lot on this wealth transfer to widows, when they, and if, as we know a lot of them do, decide to change advisor, it's often driven by the next generation who will say, oh, well, we were ignored as well. So the message is not just focus on this first point of transfer laterally. Don't ignore that next generation, because you have to remember by the time they inherit wealth, they're in their 60s. We're not talking about children. We're talking about people who will by that stage need their own advice. So don't ignore that wider family, and the sooner you start those conversations, the better. And I think one of the things I always learned when I was speaking to advisors about this was, focus on the process, not the money, because we don't like talking about how much there is, but let's talk about power of attorney and where the will is, and is there an accountant, and all of that piece. And that's a for want of a better description, a kind of threatening conversation. So I'm not going to tell you how much there is if we feel angsty about that, but let's talk about what will happen. And none of us like to have these conversations, do we? But it's so important that people know what is going to happen. No surprises.
No, you can shock a client into it as well, because you can actually say something like, well, okay, so let's work out all the assets, and that's going to be the likely, as things stand at the moment, after April 27, this is going to be the likely tax bill. How are you going to fund that? And then just wait. Because often the numbers are quite big and then they haven't thought about it at all. And the other thing you can do is, rather than talk about numbers, if you want to bring the wider family in, is talk about a shift from, well, we can't do this anymore, but what we can do is consider, it may not be right for you, but let's talk about gifts from income. And then you start bringing in the next generation. Is there any help that do you want to give them? Could you give them? If I could generate more natural income from your portfolio, would you be interested in doing something about that? Or if we start to take the pension, because we haven't until now, we could do something with that.
Maybe even ask them now, which of you siblings are going to be in charge of looking after your parents' affairs, and then watch as everyone turns to the eldest daughter or to the unmarried child, whether it's male or female, because usually that burden falls on them, and perhaps they're not even aware of that themselves. So then you know where their education piece needs to go.
But Vanessa, your point is really important in terms of engaging that wider family and looking at where or who needs help, because I've often talked about wealth transfer in the context of people want to pass on with a purpose. I don't want to just give you a large cheque, or not any longer, fire it into the bank account. I want to know what's going to happen with it, because actually it was my hard-earned cash. So we feel quite passionate about it. I'm happy to share it, but I don't want it spent, and I've talked a lot about crypto habits of my children, but if I can help out with school fees, for example, or mortgages, or how can I help, but make it feel like there's a purpose to it, and
not just a better holiday.
And know where the money is going to go, and I think that's always quite important as well.
Well, before you give away a penny of your money, you have to make sure you can sleep at night without worry, and that's your starting point. And then you look at what's available after that, and then you start talking about the possibility of doing things. And often people do want to do something, but they must preserve themselves and make sure that their situation is completely sorted before they do that.
And these are the sort of conversations and the way of having those conversations with women that perhaps you just need to do a little bit more of.
It's so rewarding, isn't it?
And they often, I remember speaking to an advisor about it, and she said, when I see a female client come in the diary, I just double the amount of time, because it takes longer to have the conversation, because there's often an education piece, and these women often come with shame. They're ashamed that they haven't had the time to do it, they haven't sat down and understood it, particularly in the widows space, and suddenly they're left with what feels like at times chaos, but they think, I should have understood this earlier, and it just takes longer to help them understand everything, and to think about what the plan is going to look like. So there's just some, I think, simple actions actually that we can all take in terms of the language that we use, the explanations that we give, and just giving time and space for these conversations to take place. If these women are leaving, then it's a risk to business. So I've always talked about the great wealth retention, but it's a huge opportunity for those advisors who are really working well in this space and doing a lot of great things for these female clients. And I always say, what are some of the actions? Because it's always got to be actionable. Like, do you look female friendly? And that doesn't mean having a pink website, right? Absolutely not. But we know that women tend to refer much more than men do in their daily lives. So often these widows will refer each other to speak to my advisor. The first thing they often do is check the website. And it was interesting, we did some really simple research a few years ago, and the number of websites, advisor websites, that had no female testimonials, no female-only case studies, no images of a female-only client. So it feels like there's some simple changes that can be made, but it's a huge opportunity in terms of the amount of money that is transferring to these spouses.
And that's a very simple and very easy, and in some ways very cosmetic thing that you can do, but it just improves the brand, and it sort of subconsciously makes you more appealing to someone who's got all this wealth. You've gained a client.
And it's not, I'm always keen to point out, this is not just an advisor challenge. So there was a great piece of data that said 8 out of 10 asset managers think of their default client as a male. Really interesting. So how do we all behave across the industry that means that we don't at times appear welcoming to female clients. And that's right back to things like the language that we use and how we engage. And I think, we should all bear it in mind, because if these women are genuinely going to hold significant majority of some of the majority of the wealth in the UK, how do we help them on that investment journey, and how do we make sure that the outcomes for them are as good as they should be?
Absolutely, and now especially with the IHG rules changing, there's even more impact. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's huge opportunity. I mean, we talk about the worries of it, but if you can get your head around this and find ways of communicating about it, it's a massive opportunity over the next few years.
Well, that's really hugely important, and I think actually very encouraging, and lots of opportunities there for advisors to have positive conversations with clients and potential clients.
Yeah.
So let's close that. Let's close that advice and that pension gap and the investment gap. Well, sadly, that is all we've got time for. But from Vanessa and myself, thank you so much for watching. You can find FT Advisors podcasts on all the usual places. And for more information on the Women's Wealth Alliance, please visit the Consumer Duty Alliance website. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.